When it comes to the roster of the Detroit Lions, Brad Holmes has done an absolutely superb job of building it up from what it used to be 3 years ago. However, though, for this one position, Brad Holmes has almost seemed to have a kryptonite factor when it comes to fixing it. We're going to talk about it in this episode, folks, so stay tuned.
What are we? What makes us what we are and what we're going to be? It's grit. It's what we started with last year, guys. Doesn't matter if you have one ass cheek and 3 toes. I will beat your ass.
Can definitely compete with the big dogs.
10-5 end zone touchdown Detroit Lions.
You guys are unbelievable, man. I'm telling you.
We are driven by Detroit.
Hello, all Lions fans, and welcome on back to yet another episode of MCM Motor City Mania. I'm your host, David T. Pike, and as always, we're diving on in. So, here's the thing, folks. For anybody who has watched my channel, anybody who has watched my content, anybody who knows who I am, you all know that I am a huge fan, a huge supporter of what GM Brad Holmes has done with the Detroit Lions. And to further go with that thought process, if you've been a follower of the Lions for any time over the last, say, 20, 30-something years, you know the idea for the Lions having what I would call a complete roster, a roster that looks good from top to bottom, doesn't seem to have any holes in it, is a concept that is rather foreign to us as Lions fans. And I would even say to the Lions organization, because for many of the years, the Lions rosters, they simply just were not complete. They might have a talented player, here or there, maybe in a position 1, 2, or 3, you never know. But most of the time, the rosters were kind of patched work together. They were filled with a bunch of people that normally would have been considered role players, depth players, backup players for other teams. But for us, they were our starters. And that, in my opinion, came from long-standing roster mismanagement over the last, 3, different regimes. Whether it was the Matt Millen era, whether it was the Martin Mayhew era, whether it was the Bob Quinn era. Each one had something that was completely different about how they mismanaged it, but the whole point is that they all mismanaged the roster in some facet. Now, Brad Holmes comes in, and he comes in with Dan Campbell. He comes in with Chris Spielman. He comes in with all of these new guys that have a different way of understanding, a different way of building and managing a roster, and the philosophy about how they're doing it, the technique about how they're going to build the roster up. They have instilled an idea that has finally changed. It's finally built a roster, that is actually being done the correct way. Again, I like to kind of set up a little bit of a history background so that way you guys kind of know where I'm coming from with this. And, over the course of the last 3 years, Brad Holmes has done an absolutely, as I've said, amazing, stupendous, wonderful, superb job of rapidly transforming this roster from being one that was absolutely, completely destitute of any talent, was absolutely without any sort of hope for future success or aspirations of success, to now it is a very talented roster. It has high expectations to win and to compete for a Super Bowl and to compete for division titles year after year after year. And Brad Holmes has done this mostly through the draft, but he's also been able to do it primarily through some very sound, very good, key free agent acquisitions. Such guys like Kevin Zeitler that we just picked up, DJ Reader as well, Alex Anzalone, Graham Glasgow, Kaminsky, Montgomery, Khalif Raymond. You guys know who I'm talking about here. And we've gone over all the different kinds of draft picks over the last 3, now going on 4 years that Brad Holmes has had. And like I said, Brad Holmes has done an absolutely wonderful, stupendous job of building this roster up to where it is currently. However, though, the best way I'm going to describe it is this. For every person that you would call a master, or if every person that you would call great at what they do, there is no such thing as being great without having a weakness. There is no such thing as, without having a flaw in how you do things or how you have gotten to where you're at or something you may not have addressed. And for Brad Holmes, I'm going to say this right now, yet again, I love what the man has done for this Lions team, for the roster, how he's built it, how he's managed it. But my God, this one position, I don't know what it is, but Brad Holmes has seemingly overlooked, has not really done much to actually try and solve or fix this one position. And some people probably are like, well, David, what the hell are you talking about? What position at this point? Because there's quite a couple that some people would probably want to talk about. But this is one that I think most people would probably agree upon once we actually get into it. And that's the damn kicking position. I'm sorry. We have not been able, under Brad Holmes, to get a consistent kicking solution or established kicker for any sense of a word. Because for me, that is one of the biggest things that is missing from this roster that, like I said, Brad Holmes has completely overturned almost over the last 3 years, now going on 4 years, is that we don't have an established kicker. We don't have a consistent kicker. We don't have a kicker that gives us the ability to, again, if things are close, if we're in a tight spot, if it's a tight, crunch time, we can send a guy out there and it's like, hey, you know what? We don't even have to worry about this. And I don't know how many more times that I need to say it or how many more times I have to prove it, but the Lions absolutely must find a long-term solution to the kicking problem. And today's episode, I am going to give the most in-depth, the most statistical backing up of evidence that I possibly can that, listen, if there's anything Brad Holmes definitely needs to fix for the remainder of this offseason, it's got to be the kicking problem. I know there are people that are probably going to say, hey, we need another wide receiver. Some are probably going to say we need more offensive line depth. Some are going to say we need another edge rusher opposite of Aiden Hutchinson. And all those are other areas that Brad Holmes can improve upon too. But my God, I'm telling you, the kicking problem is got to be number one on my board because let's just understand this. Again, using the historical narrative of the Lions. The Lions used to be the gold standard for longevity and continuity when it came to kicking. Now, that sounds great, but let's also understand that that's kind of a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of, compliment. And the reason why is because the Lions, for the most part, over the course of time that we're talking about here, which is from the 1980s all the way up to the 2020s, they literally had those top quality kickers because, well, that for some years was the only real weapon that we had. And I'm talking about guys like Eddie Murray, Jason Hanson, and Matt Prater. Those were guys that, hey, you know what? If we don't have anything else, we've got a kicker that can get us into points where, hey, we might not be able to score touchdowns, but if we send them out there for a field goal, there's a high probability we're going to get it. Now, after Jason Hanson retired in 2012, the Lions kind of already went through this situation that we're going through right now where, hey, you know what? We didn't really have an answer at kicker. For 2 years, we were like trying to figure out a solution at kicker. 2013, we brought in David Akers for a year. It was okay, but it wasn't really all that good. And then in 2014, things got even worse until we got a little bit of luck. And that's when we got Matt Prater, who was released by the Broncos due to something that happened in terms of the law. The Lions pounced on him, and then for the next 7 years after that, we had solid, established kicking again. And then when Prater left, now we're in the situation that we currently are. And again, like I've been trying to say here, it is a problem that every single year has gotten worse and worse and much more of an eyesore for Lions fans. Because you have to think about it. The Lions, like I said, they used to be the gold standard for kickers. But ever since Matt Prater left in 2020, the Lions have just simply not had much reliability with their kickers. Again, ever since Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have come to Detroit, we've had 6 different kickers over the last 3 seasons. Think about that. This is what makes this embarrassing, in my opinion. The Lions have had 6 kickers that they have tried out in the last 3 years. If you think about that, over the course of time from 1980 to 2020, the Lions primarily used the same amount of kickers. So in the last 3 years, we've used 6 different kickers versus over the last, some 30, 40 years, we had used 6 kickers. And 3 kickers were primarily responsible for those 30, 40-something years. Eddie Murray was the kicker from 1980 to 91. Then Jason Hansen from 92 to 2012. Then you had David Akers in 2013. Nate Freese and Alex Henry were there for like the first, 6-something games in 2014. And then Matt Prater got picked up, and from the rest of 2014 all the way through 2020, that was the kicking, kind of carousel we had for those, like I said, 30-something, 40-something years. But in the last 3 years for the Lions, it's been Riley Patterson twice for 2 separate years, Austin Seibert, Ryan Santoso, Aldrick Rosas, Michael Badgley, and Dominic Eberle. And most of these guys, I have, not very much of any sort of, recognition other than the fact that, hey, they were Lions. I know the fact that they played for us. Other than that, I couldn't really pick them out of a crowd unless I really was a big, kicker fan, which I like kickers, but not that much. So, having established that historical narrative, I decided to say, you know what? I'm going to provide every single statistical backing that I can give that proves that this has got to be the thing that Brad Holmes fixed right now. He has to fix it. And so that's why we're going to start this whole thing with a baseline idea of how the stats measure up between the kickers of the past. So the 3 primary ones, which is Prater, Hansen, and Murray, versus the 3 primary ones that Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have had, which would be Patterson, Seibert, and Badgley. So I decided to say, okay, let's take a look at how those 3 versus each other do in terms of their total stats as far as kicking. Kicks made, kicks attempt, the whole 9 yards. Here's what the stats look like for the kickers of the past. You're going to see Murray's stats as far as the kicks that he made versus attempted, Hansen, Prater, the whole 9 yards. You're going to see what their percentage was for the Lions while they were doing it. And then you're going to see the total conglomeration of it. So again, you've got just a little over 80% for the whole group. Hansen and Prater were a little bit over 80%. Murray was at about 75%. So not exactly the greatest overall numbers, but not terrible either. Then you take a look at Holmes' kickers over the last, 3 years. You've got Patterson, Seibert, and Badgley, who Patterson is kicking in the 90s, Seibert in the mid-70s, and then Badgley in the mid-80s, for a total of the group would be 85%. So at first glance, what you're seeing is it looks like that Holmes kickers have performed better, as they actually have almost a 5%, positive difference between the past kickers. However, though, this is where I start really going into the statistics to really show that that number of 85.5% versus the past kickers for the Lions of 80.7% is very, very misskewed if you don't really take a look at the total data. Think about this, folks. When it comes to the kickers, I would tell you this right now. Most Lions fans are looking for a kicker, one that is accurate, but also has long ball consistency, being able to kick field goals from 50 yards or more. Here's what I'm going to show you. Again, let's take a look at the kickers of the past versus the kickers that have been under Brad Holmes. If you take a look at Murray, Hansen, and Prater and all the kicks that they made and attempted that were from 50 yards or more out, the total for that group is 60% almost. It's 0.2% off, but it's pretty much 60%. You take a look at Brad Holmes' kickers, it's only 44.4%. Think about that, folks. The difference is vast when it comes to the kickers of the past of the Lions versus Brad Holmes' kickers. You have a 15.4% difference that swings widely in favor for the guys of the past, Murray, Hansen, and Prater. And if you think about it, take a look going back to the guys that we've had in the last, 3 years. Patterson, 1 for 3. Seibert, 1 for 3. Badgley is the best so far with 2 for 3. But again, you're already seeing a pattern here. We haven't really been kicking a whole lot from 50-plus yards out, which, that might be a reflection on Dan Campbell's aggressive style of play calling, or it could also be the fact that the Lions simply don't trust their kickers to make it from 50 yards out unless it's a certain situation. Because again, you take a look at the guys that I'm talking about from the past, you got guys that pretty much were kicking from the 50-yard out or more quite often. So again, long ball consistency is something that I know for Lions fans that want an upgraded kicker, a better kicker, is something that is extremely important to them. It's extremely important to me. Now, I said that's one way you could look at this to point out that there's a need that has to be, facilitated for upgrading the kicking position. Pardon me. But I decided to then say, you know what? How do these kickers match up in terms of the averages of the NFL from the time that they were kicking? And that's where this really shows how bad this is for a Brad Holmes and not having addressed this. Let's take a look at these stats again. Let's take a look at the kickers of the past. Murray, Hansen, and Prater. Over the course of the time that they were kicking for the Lions, for Eddie Murray, his average was 77.1% from 1980 to 1991. He was making field goals at about 77% of the time. For Jason Hansen, 82.4%. Matt Prater, 84.4%. That was the total in terms of the stats that they had for completion percentage in kicking when they were at the Lions. The longest field goal average that they had at that time, for Murray, it was 51 yards. For Hansen, it was 52 yards. And for Matt Prater, it was for 57. I then said, okay, for the years that those guys kicked for us, what was the average in total for the rest of the NFL? That you got for Murray's time period from 1980 to 1991, it was for 70.3%. The average long was about 50 yards. For Jason Hansen's time frame, it was about 79.7%. It was about 51 for terms of a long field goal. And for Matt Prater, it had jumped up to 84% and 54 for the long. So what you're going to notice here is this. Take a look at how the Lions kickers' stats look versus how the averages for the NFL stats look. Every single one of those kickers from the past, their averages, their stats are better. They are well above average in comparison to the NFL's at the time that they were playing. So what you're seeing is that the Lions kickers from the past were always above the standard of what the rest of the NFL was doing at the time. Now, let's take a look at Brad Holmes' kickers. First one up on the docket, Riley Patterson. For Riley Patterson, he was able to actually surpass in terms of the completion percentage of kicking field goals in terms of, actually putting them through the uprights. Both times that he was with the Lions, he surpassed that category. But when it came to the actual length of his field goals, he didn't even come close. In 2021, his longest field goal was 49 yards. The average length was 55 yards for the NFL at the time. In 2023, he got it up to 52, but the average length of the NFL at the time was 56. So great, Riley Patterson is very accurate. But again, what we already knew about Riley Patterson is that he doesn't have very much range. You then go to Michael Badgley. Michael Badgley, again, was able to get decent stats. But the problem is that you take a look at the 2023 season where he kicked 100%, which that is above the rest of the NFL's average. But he only kicked the ball 4 times. I'm not going to reward a guy for only kicking the ball 4 times. It's like, dude, at that point, that's not even worth mentioning. You came in at the end of the season because Riley Patterson played 13 of the games that the Lions played that year. He played 4 games for the Lions. So that means he made pretty much 1 kick per game. My whole point is that, again, you take a look at the stats, Michael Badgley pretty much didn't do anything that was better than what the rest of the NFL kickers were doing at the times that he was performing. And then you take a look at Austin Seibert. The exact same thing was going on. Again, the percentage was not better than what the rest of the NFL was doing. Neither was his ability to kick longer than the rest of the NFL. Again, what you're seeing is a continual pattern here. The kickers of the past that the Lions had, they always surpassed the averages of the rest of the NFL from the time that they were playing. Whereas the kickers that we've had over the last 3 years, they have not been able to do that. Not even come close, pretty much. Think about that. You're talking about how the Lions used to have some of the best kickers in the NFL compared to the rest of the NFL, and it showed in how they performed versus how over the last 3 years, the Lions have not been able to get much of anything out of their kickers that is remotely even better than what the rest of the NFL is doing. And that, to me, is a massive problem. But again, it only continues to get worse. Think about this, folks. I decided to then say, okay, that's what the total is. But when you actually go in and you go season by season by season by season, which let me tell you something, When you're talking about 40 years worth of data for Matt Prater, Jason Hanson, and Eddie Murray, the numbers start getting a little wonky. But think about this, folks. I decided to take a look at how well those kickers did over every single season that they were in the NFL. Were they able to surpass or beat the rest of the NFL's average? How many times did they do it? Here's what you're going to find out. If they were able to beat them both, whether it was the percentage or the length as well, I decided to mark that. For the kickers of the past, they were able to beat both the average of the NFL in terms of percentage and distance of field goals kicked 23 out of the total 40 seasons that they all kicked. Think about that. 23 divided by 40, that is 58% of the time. 58% of the time, the Lions kickers of the past were able to over average what the rest of the NFL was doing for both field goal percentage and in terms of the distance that they were able to kick the football. Then when you take a look at whether or not they were able to do one or the other, it jumps up to an astronomical 34 out of the 40 seasons that they were kicking. That's 85% of the time. So pretty much what you're seeing here is that the Lions kickers of the past were able to not only match what the rest of the NFL was doing majority of the time, but they were also being able to outperform most of the other kickers far and away. It wasn't even close. But again, when you take a look at Brad Holmes' kickers over the last 3 years, like I said, none of the kickers were able to match both or supersede both of those statistical categories. So that's a 0 out of 58% comparison to the kickers of the past. Whereas only Riley Patterson really was able to supersede the completion percentage or the field goal percentage in both years that he was with the Lions. Which, let's think about this. Patterson, that's 2 years. Cyber, that's 2 years. Badgley, that's 2 years. So you're talking about 6 seasons really in total. That's only 33%, folks. 0 compared to 58%, 33% compared to 85%. I'm just going to point this out there. I went to school, and I can tell you this right now. 0 is a terrible grade, and 33% ain't much better, especially when you're comparing 58% and 85% to those two numbers. It shows just vastly how pathetically bad our kickers have been over the last 3 seasons compared to what we used to have from 1980 to 2012 and 2014 to 2020. It's just absolutely damn sad, really. It really is atrocious. Pardon me. Now, I'm the type of person that I don't believe in addressing a problem without providing a solution. And I have obviously multiple times, and you guys that have watched my channel know that I have expressed repeatedly for Holmes to find a permanent solution to the revolving door kicker. And I have talked about, hey, maybe Brad Holmes goes out and drafts one of the kickers that were in the draft, whether it was Joshua Carty. I know other people talked about, Cam Little, Will Reichard, and all these other guys that were in the draft. This was a really good draft for kickers. But yet the Lions passed on drafting any of the top kickers in this draft. And while I can't say I wasn't surprised at that, it definitely was a little bit disappointing. Especially when you can take a look at the fact that since the draft has been done, all the Lions have done to really add to the kicking competition is gone out and signed former U of M UDFA kicker James Turner. You want to know why that's disappointing? The longest made kick he made while he was in the NCAA was 50 yards. You want to know what his college field goal percentage from 50 plus yards out or more is? 4 out of 10, 40%. That's horrible. And it's not much better when you're talking about from 40 to 49 yards. He only has completed 17 out of 25 kicks from the 40 to 49 yard mark, which is only 68%. So instead of going out and getting somebody who can really compete with Michael Badgley, who is our current kicker, you got a guy that really is more or less just a camp body. But there remains one last hope, one last chance at redemption where Brad Holmes could really bring in somebody who could really push the needle. And everybody knows who I'm talking about. It's freaking Jake Bates of the UFL Michigan Panthers. Bates has literally caught a tidal wave of attention and media hype from Lions fans due to his unbelievable kicking strength when it comes to kicking field goals. The guy is just absolutely ridiculous in his ability to kick the long ball, but not only in how far he can kick it, but the consistency in which he can kick it. Think about it, folks. When we take a look at Jake Bates and his recent performances in the UFL, Jake Bates just had a game where he kicked 5 out of 5 field goals, and one of them was a 60-yard field goal, which helped his team win a tight 28-27 game. So think about that. Very consistent. When you get all 5 of your field goals in and you're able to kick one from 60 yards out, not only do you have the ability to have the range, but you have the consistency factor. But again, Jake Bates also holds the current UFL spring football record for longest field goal in spring football history, and that's at 64 yards. And if you take a look at his current total of kicks from, 60 plus yards or more, he's made 3 out of 4. So he's kicking 75% from 60 yards or more. There's not a lot of kickers that can do that. So for me, getting Jake Bates is important for 4 main reasons. The first reason is that Bates would give the Lions a game-sealing, a game-changing weapon that would be able to have a long-range weapon that the Lions haven't had since Matt Prater was here. And think about this, folks. I actually had to double-check this just to make sure. Matt Prater never once officially kicked a field goal of 60-plus yards or more for the Detroit Lions. The longest field goal he ever got for the Lions was 59 yards. But we already know that Jake Bates can kick 60 yards at Ford Field because we've seen him do it now 3 separate times. So it's like, okay, we know this guy is very good at what he does. But with Bates, you now know that if the game is close and hey, you know what, you're around that 40-yard mark, there's a very solid chance you send him out there, he's going to make the kick. That is a great comfort. That is a great insurance policy to have if your offense kind of stalls, which we've seen our offense kind of stall sometimes in later parts of the game. That's just the way it is. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2, think about it. It would further solidify the roster. It would mean the roster is just that much more closer to being complete as far as having strengths at every single position on the roster. That is a good thing to have. Number 3, it would also further continue the rich history and tradition, the prestige that the Lions have had over the last 40-something years of having great success and continuity at the kicker position. It would be, how do I put this? It would kind of be like, hey, you know what? We're keeping that tradition alive of having great kickers. But in this sense, we're not doing it now because it's the only thing we've got. We're doing it now because, hey, we're just adding a further strength to what we already have in the team. And the final reason is, you have to think about this. You would lock up an extremely important but often overlooked position in the NFL because you have to think about it. For many years, how do I put this? Providing the stability and the distinct advantage of having a great kicker is something that most people don't think about until it's really crunch time. But if you're able to have that position locked up for a multitude of years, you don't have to worry about it. That's why I said when we had Murray, when we had Hansen, when we had Prater, we never had to worry about the kicking position because it was like, listen, we've got that position locked down. That's a great feeling to have. But if you're able to get a guy that can consistently kick from 60-plus yards out or more, I would say this, that right there puts the Lions in a position where only a couple of other teams can realistically compete with the Lions when it comes down to a crunch situation where it's like, hey, it's a tight game, you just need to get to about the 40, 35-yard line, and then, hey, you're within Jake Bates' range. Now you have a chance to get a game-sealing field goal so where the Lions can win the game rather than potentially losing the game. And that, again, is a great thing to have. My whole point is this. If there's one position that Brad Holmes absolutely, without doubt, must fix this offseason, once the UFL season is done, he has to sign Jake Bates. We have got to get a better kicker. It's not saying that Michael Badgley is terrible, but let's be fair and honest here. He's not a guy for a long-term solution for the Lions. We need something better. And as far as I'm concerned, the stats prove it, and all the Lions fans are seeing the exact same thing I'm seeing. Jake Bates is the answer. Point blank, no debate about it. But anyway, I wanted to put this very detailed, very, long episode out because it's like, listen, I love looking at stats, and when I am able to find stuff like this really excites me. But having put that all together, I'm going to end the episode and say thank you all for watching another episode of MCM Motor City Mania. If you like what you saw, by all means, I highly encourage all to do one of these 3 things, like, comment, and subscribe. If by chance you subscribed in the past, forgot to do so at the time, or you just subscribed and not had a chance to do so, again, highly encourage y'all please to subscribe. It helps out the channel. After you've subscribed, I also encourage y'all please make sure you hit that bell notification icon as well, so that way you never miss any more content that I push out. Also encourage y'all to share this content with your Lions friends and family members. Share it here on YouTube, share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, share it anywhere and everywhere you can with everybody and anybody that you can. The more we can share it, the greater the channel grows and spreads. And with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the content. Hope you all got something that makes you happy, makes you smile today. And I just want to say to everybody, God bless, and until the next time we meet, I'll see you all in the next episode.